Hi, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to show you how to get started with GraphQL and Laravel 8. GraphQL is a powerful query language that lets you query data from different data sources. Those data sources could be APIs, databases, or really any data store. It lets you retrieve data in whatever format that's convenient for you. I'll show you how. First of all, we need to set up a Laravel project. I'll do this using Composer. To do this using Composer, I'm going to type Composer, create project. I'll say Laravel, and I'll call my project GraphQL sample. I'll hit enter and I'll let Composer install all the dependencies needed for this application to run. Once that's done, I'll navigate to the project folder and open it up in VS Code. So it's done. I'll navigate into the project folder, which is GraphQL sample, and I'll open it up in VS Code using code with period. And now we have the project open. The next step for me would be to set up a database that we could talk to. The reason we're setting up a database is to have somewhere where the data we persist or mutate in terms of GraphQL is saved somewhere and that we can see that the data is actually being changed. This step is optional, as you could use a SQLite or any data store that you like. I'll call this test, and that's all. The next step would be to install the GraphQL package for Laravel. The GraphQL package for Laravel that I will be using is called Rebing GraphQL Laravel. And to install that, I'll open the terminal in Visual Studio Code so that I have it handy. And to do that, I would run Composer, require, and I'll say Rebing / GraphQL Laravel, and Composer is going to get all the dependencies and have this set up. As we can see, it's done. The next step would be to publish the configuration file. Publishing the configuration file allows us to customize how we use the GraphQL package. To do this, we quickly run a PHP artisan command. We say PHP artisan vendor publish and /. We specify the provider, and in this case our provider is Rebing / GraphQL service, GraphQL first, then GraphQL service provider. And we close this. And it's complete. So it's copied a file from the vendor file, which is where all Composer installs are saved. And it's moved it to /config / GraphQL. And we can find it here under config, and we would see that we have GraphQL. For this tutorial, I'm going to go over the basics that we need to get started with the configuration file. So on the configuration file, we could find the route object. And the route object basically defines how we want to access GraphQL. The prefix is GraphQL, so that means our app / GraphQL would be the default to access the GraphQL server. The controller is the controller that handles the GraphQL request and the routing. And this comes with the package, so we don't need to change it for now. The middleware would be any middleware we want to apply for the GraphQL route group. So say you wanted an authentication middleware, a throttling middleware, you could define those here and they would automatically be applied to everything that goes through your prefix or your controller route. The group attributes are additional route attributes that you would like to pass to GraphQL. The next thing that's of importance is the schemas. The schemas define the different types that make up GraphQL queries, mutations, and types. So the default one contains a bunch of stuff. It contains query, mutation, types. A query in GraphQL is basically a GET request. It tells us data that we could return by accessing a particular route or model. A mutation is a change in state, and that could be a post, a put. Anytime data needs to change state, if we need to update data, if we need to change something, if we need to save data, that could fall in under mutation. Types sort of help us format how a query result looks like. So the type defines what a result should contain and what its children should be made of. I'll clarify this when we go in details. Before we get started, I'd like to make some seed data. This data would be what would be returned when we make a query to the GraphQL server. There's already a default seed file created for us with the users model, and we'll just be using that. So if we go to databases, go to seeders, database seeder, we will uncomment this. Save the file, and we will run php artisan, migrate, and I'll add fresh just in case there's something on the DB, and I'll say seed. And we have users seeded. Now, the next step would be to start creating our GraphQL files. To do that, usually I'd go to my app folder, make a GraphQL folder just for organization, and organize everything under the GraphQL folder. So we'll go ahead, make a GraphQL folder. In that folder, I'm going to make in 3 folders. One folder to hold my types, another folder to hold my queries, and the third folder, you guessed it, mutations. And to start querying GraphQL, in order to return a user, we need to know what makes a user. And if we go to our models and click on user, we'll see that a user is made up of a name, an email, a password, an ID, a password token. For our own unique case, we would be concerned with only returning the ID of the user, the name of the user, and the email of the user. So I'll go ahead into types. I'll make a new file, and I'll call it userstypes.php. And I'll add my PHP import. We would define the namespace for this, and this would be app/GraphQL types. The next thing would be to import our which we're using the user model, and we'll define a class. We'll call it users types, user type, and this extends a GraphQL type. We need to define protected attributes. And this is a variable. And it does a good job of suggesting this. We'll say users. We'll say description. And there we have it. And we close this. The next thing will be to define the fields that we want to return. And that's easy. We say public function the fields. and this is going to return an array of objects. So this would be ID, and we'll define what an ID is. An ID would have a type, and that type would be non-null. So what it means is an ID can never be null, and ID will also be a type of integer. So that tells us that our ID will always be a number. It doesn't matter if we're using big int or just int on the database model, they should be able to type it. The next thing we would do is to add a description so that it shows up when we're querying GraphQL server. This tells people what that field is supposed to hold and serves like some documentation about the field. And we will say this is the ID of the user. And that's all for ID. We would repeat the same thing for the email and the username. So I'll duplicate this, and this is looking for this. So we're going to add a bunch of types. We're going to say GraphQL definition type. We're going to say rebing to get GraphQL type, and we need one more, facades. Yeah. And for some reason this is squiggly line here, but I don't think it's a problem. So for this, we would define what an email is. So our email, this will be the email of the user. Our email is a string, so we don't want to say it must be non-null. Sometimes maybe we don't have an email for some reason, but we'll type it to be a string. For our name, we would do the same thing, and it might be non-null, and we want it to be a string. And yeah, so that's all we need to return our GraphQL. Now that we have our users type defined, the next thing would be to define our query type. So we're going to define our users query, and we're going to create a file for that. We'll say users query.php and php. We're going to get our model app, model users, and we're going to make a class and call this users query, and it's going to extend query, which we haven't imported, and we're going to say this extends, not extend, and we're going to import a query. It's going to be under rebing GraphQL, and we're going to say support query. There we go, and that defines it. So the next thing would be also to define our protected attributes. This just helps the GraphQL controller to build out what a user is and describe what this is. The next thing we need is to define a type. So what does this return? And we can say this returns function type, and no, it's not list of paginates for now. We're going to say this returns a GraphQL type. I use this, and it's a list of the GraphQL type users. So we don't have GraphQL defined, we define that. We're going to say use rebing, and we reach out to the GraphQL's facade. So support and we should say facades / GraphQL. Yep, that's the correct one. And after defining type, the next thing we want to do is to define our arguments. Our arguments are sort of like things that could be added to the query. So we want to say args, and we throw in a return, and what we want to return is an ID, and we define what the name of our ID. So we'll say this is called ID, and the type of ID is a type of int. We do the same thing for email. So what we're essentially saying is that ID can be an argument, email can be an argument that we can query by. And we throw this in. Don't forget to close this. The next thing would be to resolve this query. So the resolution is what you want to do when someone queries. That would be reaching out to the database, either using eloquent models. You might want to query database directly. You might even want to reach out to a third-party API, a different system, and return the data you want when people query the user. So I'll say function resolve, and resolve takes a bunch of arguments. So it takes root, it takes the arguments you pass through, it also takes something called select fields, and hopefully that's the correct part, which defines the fields we are selecting, and then we define this. So what we want to do is, for now, we might just want to say return. We'll come back and modify this to make use of the different things. We'll say user.all for now. And basically what we want to say is whenever someone gets users, we want to return this type, which is a list of users, which we defined here, and that means each user is going to have an ID, an email, and a name. So we're returning this type whenever someone calls the users query, and the way we get the data we're returning is by querying users.all. We're going to advance this further and make it more complex so that you could query by these arguments. On setting this up, we need to go back to the config and tell GraphQL how to find our different types and our query. That's pretty simple. We go to GraphQL and we scroll down. So here it tells us how to define a class or reference a query class. So we know we have users query, and we can import that, and we say this class. So what it means is GraphQL is going to find users query, and that would be available to us. We don't have any mutations yet, so we'll skip that. For types, we have users type, and we import that, and that's it. Automatically, when we serve our application using PHP Artisan Serve, we should be able to go to /GraphQL and see this. We'll try it out. Just to confirm, it doesn't seem like it added the reference, but hopefully it runs. So I'll go ahead and just add the type so that we don't get any errors when we try to run this. GraphQL users query and semicolon, all errors cleared. For this, oh, I know, we need to type it. So we say array, and that takes care of it. No squiggly lines. This is basically just typing the return, what the return type is. So it's return of this or this. For this, we're returning an array, so we say array also, and that should fix it. This one is not complaining for now. The next step would be to run our application. We say PHP artisan serve, and we have our app serving. So to browse our GraphQL server, one of the ways we could do that is use a GraphQL client, or we could use a simple REST client like Postman or Insomnia. I'm going to be using a simple REST client, or rather I'll use a GraphQL client called Graphical. I'll show you in a bit. So this is Graphical. It's a GraphQL client. You could download it for Mac or Windows. And basically how we do this is once the app is running, we throw in the URL and we say /GraphQL and enter, and we have an error. It says GraphQL exception, types users not found, and it's looking for users. And if we go to our types, we named it users with a capital, so maybe we want to capitalize it back. That fixes it. So now the advantage of the typing and what we've done is that we are able to go to docs, we can click on queries, and we have users and it says a query. So, and if we look at users query, it says a query. So we could start to write description that could help other developers or other engineers to figure out how to use our application. So we can say a query to return all the users in the database, and we save that. And if we come back here, reload this, go to queries, and we have it. So we can click on users, and as we can see, our users can take in an integer or an email. And that's because in our users query, we defined arguments and we said it can be ID, email. For now, I'm going to take out this and show you. And what this is our users doesn't need anything, and we could just call it, and it returns all these fields. To test our GraphQL query, I'll throw this away, and it will be query. We can use named or unnamed query. I could say users list as our name. And basically all I have to do is say users and what I want. So say I want just the ID, I could throw this in. If I want the ID with name only, I could throw this in. And so it says, so I know that's because this, we're going to use that in a bit. So we say this, and if we hit it, we should have, yeah. So we have our list of users with name, and we could add email, and this gives us the email. Say we don't want the name, we could take it out. Say we don't want the ID, we could take it out. And that's the power of GraphQL. You could begin to query things and request for only data that you need and not returning everything that the user wants. This gives flexibility and makes it easy for front-end developers to sort of query the data they require, and without the backend team having to make API endpoints for everything. The backend team or whatever team needs data could access data in a format that's convenient for them. Okay. So now we've seen the power of GraphQL. The next thing I'm going to show is how we can build or create new users. We're going to make a mutation. So we go to our mutation folder and we can call this new user mutation .php, and we define this. Don't forget the namespace. The namespace is going to be app/GraphQL mutation. That's that. And we're going to make a class, and we'll call our class new user mutation. And it extends mutation. I'm using the autocomplete just to be fast, and I'll clean this up a bit. So the same thing, we have attributes, which is what we're defining this as. We can say new user. The description, of course, it helps other people looking at our API to be able to know what we're trying to achieve. So description, a mutation to create a new user, and we define type. So the type it returns is a GraphQL type. We also need to import that this would be GraphQL/type, or ripping GraphQL/type/definition/type. The other one would be a ribbing mutation, so this is clear. The other one would be the facade, so we'll say ribbing/GraphQL support facades. We go to facades and we say GraphQL. Something else we might need, or not need, we need is models user. So we've defined the type. Here we define the arguments, which would be what do we need to create a user. So for us to make a user, we would require the username, and we define the type. So we say type string. The rules, these are the same Laravel rules, so the same form request rules apply here. We could say required, for example. We could say minimum of 3 letters, and that would apply. Anything, you could be creative with this. For email, we could do the same thing. It's type string, it's email, and this is the validation. What that means is whenever we enter something that's not email, GraphQL does the validation for us. The other thing we might want to enter is a password, so we can specify the type, say the rule, and that's that. Something else I also do like to do is to also add a name, just so that it's clear to people who are looking at this. And we say the name is email. So if we wanted to rename this something else, we could always do that. And then the next thing will be the resolve function. So when this gets called, when the arguments are passed in, what do we resolve to? What do we do? And we say resolve. And basically the same thing, we're taking root and we take our arguments. And what we can do now is to pull out the root. So we're using bcrypt just because we want to hash the password and store instead of storing plain text in the DB. It's just good practice. And the next thing is to create the user based on the arguments. And we can do a little check to make sure that the user was created. If the user was created, we return user, else we can return null. It could also be the other way around. So now that we've done this, our app is still running. Before we forget, we need to go to GraphQL, and I'll import this, use app, GraphQL, mutation, new user mutation. And we go down here where we have mutation, we say new user mutation class. And if we go back to our GraphQL, refresh this by hitting enter, we can see we have a new mutation. And if we click in, it says new user, and it expects parameters, name, email, password. And to try that out, we say this is a mutation. We can call it create user mutation, and what we want to do is call new user, and it expects a name. So we can say name, Billy. We could say email, and that would be billycloud@gmail.com, and for password we could just say password. And as we can see, this returns users. So it seems like I mistakenly said this should return an array of users. And to fix that, we're going to say we don't want the list, we just want the users. We're going to hit enter here, and if we check, now it expects only a user. So we could say ID, a name, and an email. Hopefully there is nothing else we're forgetting. Validator, mean does not exist. Mean, oh, I see it. So this is an array. It's different from when it's coming from a form where we have everything together. So we need to split it, and that should do it. So we say GraphQL again, and we hit this. It says cannot return non-nullable fields users.id, and actually this is an issue with my SQL which I'm using, and what happens there is because the ID is automatically generated, it doesn't return it in time for GraphQL to resolve, and that's specific to the IDE I'm using. But to confirm that what we sent in worked, what we can do is we could make a users query and say return ID, name, and email, and we should have our user there. And if we go, truly we have Billy Cloud there. We can choose to make a new query and create more users, rather new mutation, and new user. And if we call new user and throw in our params, so we say test user, we say email is test.test.com, and we say password. So let's see what happens when we put in maybe less than 6. So we expect this to have an ID or rather a name. And when we do this, we can see the validation error kicks in. It says the password must be at least 6 characters. And truly when we put in 6 characters or more, it should go through. So if we come here, requery this, we have our test user, and that's the way it works. So I did promise to show you how to change this to query. What we can do is the same way we checked here and grabbed arguments, we could also use the same method to grab the argument that's being passed to this. So for user query, something that we had here previously was arguments. So we're going to bring it back. We're going to say function args, and this is going to be an array. And what we want to do is return the arguments that we expect. And we're expecting an ID. And this is it. So we can have rules. We can, the same way we had rules before, we can say every time you want to query users, you need to throw in an ID. And what this is going to change is it's going to change the way our users query runs. So I'll show you. We go to docs, we go to query, and we see users now requires an ID to work. If we go ahead and query users with an ID, it wouldn't change anything. It would still return the user, all the users. That's because we've not resolved what we want to return, and I'll show you how. So to do that, all we need to do is change a couple things here. We're going to say this is going to be find or fill, and we'll throw our args, and inside it we'll access the ID. Something we need to note is when we do find or fill, we're going to be returning only one item, so we might want to change this to either a single item, or if we wanted to still return a list, we might want to change this to something like where and say ID. Or it might be best to just create a new query for this. I think I have double braces somewhere, and hopefully that should be it. And yeah, we have user with ID 1. We can do user with ID 2. I know the last user we added was ID 11. Okay, and that's how we get user by ID. So usually what people would do is make a new file, and we can say this is users list query.php, and we could just take everything we have here and say users list. Sorry, instead of users list, we could say single user for this. So it seems like I mistakenly said this should return the other one as users, an array of users. User query. And to fix that, we're going to say we don't want the list, so we just want the users query. We're going to hit enter here, and if we check, now it expects only a user. And this so we can say ID, its default, where we get all, a name, and an email. Hopefully there is nothing else we're forgetting. Arguments. And not to forget to go to our GraphQL file and add validate a new query called does not exist. Single user query class. Oh, I see it. And so this is an array. It's different from when it's coming from a form where we have everything together. So we need to split it. And if we hit our GraphQL again, and if we look under queries, that should do it. So we see it's not showing it because we still have the same name for hit this. So we call this says cannot return non-nullable fields users.id. And actually this is an issue with returns my SQL which I'm using, and we could change this to find or fill now. Because the ID is automatically generated, it doesn't return it in time for GraphQL. So we could say find or fill resolve, and that's now specific. We would no longer be bothered by using. But to confirm that what we'll just sent in worked, what we can do is type of user. We could make a user. So to also clean this up, ID instead of calling this users, we just say this is a user email, and we should have a user. We go to types, and we say this is a single user. If we go just clean, we have the cloud there, and in our user we query, can choose to make a new query. We'll return a type of user. In our mutations, we just clean up and return a type of user, and I think that's new mutation. When we go back to our query, now we have two queries. We have single user, it takes in an ID, and it returns a user. We could as well go back to the description and say a query to get the email a single user. Yes, test.test.com in the database. And if we run this, we say password, this defines it. So let's see what happens. And anyone who's looking at our query knows exactly what each query does. So we can say single user expects an ID and it gives you a user, while users doesn't expect an ID and it gives you an array name. So if we try to query this, it doesn't know what an ID is. And when we do this, and we can see the validation works. Error kicks in. If we wanted a single user, 6 characters, it would say single user with an ID of 11, 6 characters, and that should work too. So that's basically an introduction to how to use GraphQL. Let me know in the comments if you want to see more videos, if you'd like me to explain more concepts. So I did promise to show you if you want to see polymorphism, if you want to see multiple relationships that you could do in Laravel many, how that could be represented in GraphQL. The same way we checked here and grabbed arguments, we could also use the same method to grab the argument that's being passed to this. So for user query, something that we had here previously was arguments. So we're going to bring it back. We're going to say function args, and this is going to be an array. And what we want to do is return the arguments that we expect. And we're expecting an ID. And this is it. So we can have rules, the same way we had rules before. We can say every time you want to query users, you need to throw in an ID. And what this is going to change is it's going to change the way our users query runs. So I'll show you, we go to docs, we go to query, and we see users now requires an ID to work. If we go ahead and query users with an ID, it wouldn't change anything. It would still return the user, all the users. That's because we've not resolved what we want to return. And I'll show you how.